Okay, Tov. Can I ask, like I did last week, how many people here have heard of Rabbi Yosef Massas or Mashash? I see a hand or two. How many of you have ever had a chance to study anything that he wrote inside? Okay, so that makes one of us. Let's take today as an opportunity to discover a tremendous Talmid Chacham who, I will be honest with you, has been gaining, thank God, reputation in the Jewish community once again. And not that he was ever lost to us, but many people today who previously would never have come across his writings today are, Baruch Hashem, being exposed to these writings. Rabbi Yosef Massas was one of the most unique Chachamim to come out of Morocco in the last 100 years, in my opinion. Unique because he most definitely never toed anyone's party line. Not even the party line of other Chachamim Morocco. He was his own type. You cannot put him in a category. Many people try to use Rabbi Yosef Massas to compare him with other... See, look, these were the rabbis of North Africa. Really, Rabbi Yosef Massas is so unique because he's really not like any other Talmidei Chachamim that anyone may know of. It doesn't mean that he does not share similarities with others, but he is a Chad Bedo. He's one of a kind, one of a generation. I would like to introduce you today to the writings of Rabbi Yosef Massas. This may be a strange place to start, but it is a natural continuation of what we studied together last week, of thou shalt not rust, and the need to innovate in halakha, and the need to be able to change things in halakha. And so that brings me to Rabbi Yosef Massas. I spent most of my years in Israel trying to collect the writings of Rabbi Yosef Massas. I went to store after store after store, hunting down random volumes of a book here, random volumes of a book there. Baruch Hashem, I completed my library with a few books missing. Min Shemaya, HaKadosh Baruch Hu finished all of that. But there was one set that I didn't have. And I was looking for a very long time for this set. It was called the set of Otzar HaMichtavim. Let me show it to you. It's a 3-volume set of Rabbi Yosef Massas. I'm going to try to put it up to the camera so you can see. The artwork on the cover is Rabbi Yosef Massas' own artwork. He was an artist, he was a painter, he was a poet, he was many things. And these books have been out of print for a long time. I was looking from bookstore to bookstore. It turns out, I don't remember exactly what year it was, but a year or two after I got married, I was in Monsey, New York. My wife was finishing her master's degree at Yeshiva University, and I was coming to visit her in the summer. She had to go every summer for 2 months. I would visit every other week or every few weeks if I could, depending how long the Kehillat could let me go and how much I could afford the trips back and forth to New York. I come to New York and I say, listen, I've been out of the Jewish community for so long, just take me to a bookstore. She's like, Yoni, I promise you there's nothing in these bookstores here that's going to interest you. I said, just take me to wherever you can. So we went to a bookstore. I won't mention the name out of kavod to the owners of the bookstore, but I walk into the bookstore and I start looking around. You notice all the regular run-of-the-mill stuff that everybody has. So I go over to the person behind the counter and I say, tell me, do you have any Sephardic books by any chance? If I could take a picture of the face that he made when I asked that question, I could turn it to a portrait. It'll be his face says, no, why would we? That was the attitude. And I said, whoa, there are Sephardic books in the Jewish community. He said, okay, we have a few Ben Ish Chai's and Rav Avadia's over there on that shelf. He points to me some random shelf in the back of the store. I was with Elchanan, so this must have been 2015, if I had to guess. I was with Elchanan, my oldest. He was a baby. And I was going through nothing that I was so bothered that the bookstore didn't even care to have other books aside from what they have. I'm on the way out of the store, and Elchanan drops his bottle on the floor. So I get down on the floor to get the bottle, and if I could make up the story, I see on the bottom shelf of that bookcase where Elchanan dropped his bottle, I see 3 volumes of Otzar HaMichtavim laying there, covered in dust. I can't even tell you. It took a while to get the dust off the books. And I'm looking at myself, I was upset at Elchanan for dropping his bottle. I'm upset that I'm in the store that has no books that I need. And here, not only do they have Sephardic books, they have the writings of Rabbi Yosef Massas. It must be a mistake. Like somebody, this must be on reserve for somebody. It must be owned by the store owner. I take these 3 books to the front counter and I say, hey, are these books for sale? He said, of course. I said, how much do you want for them? He told me something like $60 for the set. I said, are you sure that that's all you want? He's like, listen, those books have been there since the 80s or the 90s. Nobody wants those books. If you'll take them from me, it's a mitzvah. I said, wonderful. I took the books from him, and Rabbi Yosef Massas' collection in my library was complete, and I cannot live, mamash, I cannot live a shiur, a halacha, a holiday, without the writings of Rabbi Yosef Massas. Before I get carried away, let's learn a little bit about his life. We're on page 1 in the pamphlet, A Matter of Principle. Page 1, again, from the Wikipedia article on Rabbi Yosef Massas. Unlike some of the other ones I've shared so far, this is a really weak Wikipedia article, but it has some highlights that are important to know. Rabbi Yosef Massas was born in 1892 and he died in 1974. He was born in Morocco and he passed away in Haifa, Israel. He was the rabbi of Tlemcen in Algeria. He was a rabbi, an Av Bedin in Meknes in Morocco. He later ends up in Haifa where he spends the end of his life. And he was a posek, a mishorer, a singer, a poet, historian, v'ish tzibur, and a public figure. He was born in Meknes to Rabbi Chaim Massas. Rabbi Chaim Massas was a very unique Talmid Chacham. We have one book of his that was published posthumously by his son. Rabbi Yosef Massas was very young when his father died. And his family had kept all of the handwritten manuscripts of Rabbi Chaim Massas in some kind of chest up in the attic. And he figured when he'd get older, they'd give him the chest to look through and see if there was anything of value there. Unfortunately, by the time the chest was given over to Rabbi Yosef Massas, he opens it up and sees that most of it had water damage, a lot of it was eaten by insects, and many of the pages had faded. And he did the best that he could to gather anything left in that work, as well as interview many other rabbis across Morocco who knew his father, to tell him Torah of his father. And that's what he printed in a book called Nishmat Chaim, the Soul of Chaim. That book has been recently republished by the World Sephardic Library. Yes?
Can I interrupt? I just see in the chat section that people are complaining the audio is a bit sketchy. I just want to make sure that problem is resolved.
Can everyone hear me properly?
Yeah, sorry, we had the connection issue, but we just rejoined.
No problem. Okay, thank you. I appreciate that, Rabbi.
Thank you.
Rabbi Yosef Massas goes to Algeria. You know, the borders between the North African countries are pretty fluid. They change. People fluctuate from place to place. Algeria and Morocco, don't tell any Moroccans or Algerians that they're pretty much the same country, because they don't believe it's very much the same country, but they're pretty much the same country. And the rabbis went back and forth between these communities quite naturally. Rabbi Yosef Massas spends about 17 years in Tlemcen building up a community from the ground. He goes back to Meknes after the passing of Rabbi Yaakov Toledano from the famous Toledano dynasty. If you're familiar with any of the Chachamim Toledano of the Moroccan lineage, to all their different branches. There are many different groups that came out of there. He goes to replace him as a Dayan in Meknes. And ultimately, as a Dayan in Morocco, you're not just a rabbi, but you're a rabbi in good standing with the government. You know, the chambers of the king had the chief rabbi's office in there. This was a pretty serious job description to be a Talmid Chacham in Morocco in those days. He was the cousin of another Rabbi Massas that you might hear very often, Rabbi Shalom Massas. Rabbi Shalom Massas was the younger of the two. He also has passed away since, but Rabbi Shalom Massas also was a little more, if I could use the word, mainstream of the two. Rabbi Shalom Massas comes to Yerushalayim, becomes the chief rabbi of Yerushalayim, even though him and, for example, Rabbi Ovadia Yosef have their bouts with each other about halachot, but they are on very good, cordial terms. Rabbi Shalom Massas, when he passed away, he left the chief rabbinate of Yerushalayim. That office was vacant for some 10 or 15 years until fairly recently when they reinstituted chief rabbis there. It was a very difficult position to fill, and Rabbi Shalom Massas, who was the younger cousin of the two, did it quite expertly. Like I mentioned to you before, Rabbi Yosef Massas was quite an artist. You can purchase Haggadot today. his Haggadot written not just with his artwork in it, but in his own handwriting. He used to write certain books in a beautiful kitab. I should have brought a copy for you. In a beautiful handwritten, some Rashi, some Torah script, some in different sizes and shapes. It looks like a printer printed the book in his own handwriting, and it was intended to be copied and studied from in public. He has another work written in his own handwriting called Zevach Todah, which is a book on the laws of Shechita. It's essentially a long poem that teaches you everything you need to know about the laws of Shechita with a running commentary. There's a famous piece in the back there of Rabbi Yosef Massas in which he discusses very briefly the idea of whether or not a woman can be shochatim, or shochatot, I guess would be the proper term, and why you see that even though Maran says it's okay, the Jewish community seems to have developed a different custom, and he talks about that. It's one of the few contemporary poskim who deal with such an issue in the way that he does. Let's talk for a moment about Rabbi Yosef Massas and his halachic attitudes. I'll just remind people, I don't know what's going on in the chats, but I can't check the chats while we're talking. If you want to interrupt me, just turn off your microphone and interrupt me. I'm more than happy to hear from you. Rabbi Yosef Massas was an individual. I think that's the best word I can use for him. And recently, Rabbi Chaim Amsalem, should live and be well in Yerushalayim, wrote a fascinating article on, I think I may have shared this with you last week, I don't remember anymore what I shared in which shiur, about what the approach of Chachmei Sfarad was. Is there a collective approach of the modern Chachmei Sfarad? What unites them all? And he says it's not true that they were always lenient. You see, some of them were radically extreme. Even Rabbi Yosef Massas was extremely stringent in places where other Chachamim, who were more conservative than him, for example, were lenient. He says rather what was unique in these communities was the ability of a posek to be independent, to not always look right and left before he ruled the halakha. Are they going to call me a reformer? Are they going to tell me if I'm orthodox? The job was, I have to ensure the spiritual continuity of this kehillah. That's my job. My job is to do whatever it takes to make sure that until the next chacham takes over, that I hand off the baton in good standing, that these people are still connected and still part of Am Yisrael. And it could be that for that reason, Chachmei Sfarad of the later days, when they put out innovative halachic rulings, they didn't always care to write elaborate teshuvot explaining, because it wasn't intended for your kehillah and it wasn't intended for your time. It was intended for his kehillah and his place and his time to get his people to the next step. Anyone know some famous piskei halakha of Rabbi Yosef Massas that may come off as controversial? Hugo, you said you studied some of his things. Anything off the top of your head that you remember?
Probably by far the most, I'll say it was actually my first encounter with Yosef Massas was his ruling on carrying on Shabbat, which was really mind-blowing. Should I expand on that?
Yeah, sure, please.
Basically, his argument was that it's permissible to carry on Shabbat because he defined public domain in a certain way, which basically included the Ashkenazi opinion that you need 600,000 people going through a public domain for it to be public domain. And since he couldn't think of any places where that 600, there's like a street with 600,000 people going through daily, there's no public domain. But if there's no public domain, then there's no need for these, I forgot the Hebrew word, but the intermediary domain between private and public.
Carmelite, I believe.
So it was Carmelite because it was just created by Chazal as a rabbinic fence. And so if there's no public domain, if there's no Carmelite, then everything is private domain, so you can carry everywhere.
Very good.
Which is quite a brilliant reasoning.
Rabbi Yosef Massas sees a situation in which Jews are carrying on Shabbat without an eruv. And instead of critiquing them, attacking them, he realizes he has to come up with an innovative solution. How can I justify what these people are doing on Shabbat? And he comes out with a fascinating teshuvah. You don't need eruvin. An eruv is a thing of yesteryear. Today you can carry without an eruv at all. Another psak halakha of Yosef Massas, anyone know? That was very good. Anyone else know of anything else he said?
The hair covering one?
Very good. Mort, what did he say about hair covering?
Off the top of my head, he says that we can, with regard to needing to be covered, we can look at the societies that we're in, where we see that women don't cover their hair, so therefore it's not considered to be erva, I think. So therefore, if a woman wanted to not cover her hair, I guess, she could explore that opportunity.
So Yosef Massas was approached very good by a couple who wanted to get married, and the husband had a really hard time that his future wife, didn't want to cover her hair. And Rabbi Yosef Massas goes on a very long teshuvah in which he explains that really, according to halakha, nowadays women don't have to cover their hair at all in the first place. That's a famous teshuvah of Rabbi Yosef Massas that, don't worry, has been a matter of discussion many, many times over since he wrote it. That's very good. Anyone know anything else? Any other teshuvot of Rabbi Yosef Massas? Yes. Wait, Alexander Menashe, I can't hear you. Do you hear him? I don't hear him.
No, we can't hear you. Nope. Hello.
Okay, when he figures it out, we'll get to him. When you figure it out, speak. Anyone else?
I have another one.
Yeah.
So I was more focused on Moroccan Minchagim, and he was talking about kafarot, and he was talking about that there was maybe some issues with doing kafarot, such as like the shochet has to do so many shchita on that day that he might skip like the knife hacking.
I'm impressed. That's a lesser known teshuvah of Rabbi Yosef Massas. That's very good. That's right. Rabbi Yosef Massas in general, if you're getting the picture, he was one who just sometimes came out of left field on certain issues. All of them with a common denominator. Alexander Menashe, I want to hear which teshuvah you were going to share with us.
Hey, can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you now. Baruch Hashem.
So I heard that he ruled that Christianity or Christians are not idol worshippers, and he did this on the basis that they don't believe in strict. They believe in one God. The average Christian on the street, who's maybe not so well versed in the theology, is somebody who believes in one God.
Rabbi Yosef Massas was adamant. You're correct. I have a series on this from a few years back called Churches and Mosques in Halakha, in which I explore different opinions on that topic. But Rabbi Yosef Massas went to meet with a priest in Morocco, and that's probably the root of his opinion, you should know, is that he met with a very unique brand of Christianity in North Africa that is not so reminiscent of any of the other Christianities that we're familiar with. But Rabbi Yosef Massas suggests that they're monotheists, they believe in Hashem, we have judged them wrong all of these years, and that not only is it okay to enter a church, it's absolutely okay to enter a church, and that anybody who speaks ill of Christians, and he includes Muslims, obviously, if you Christians are okay, that anyone who puts those who believe in Hashem on the other side of the fence is creating a terrible chilul Hashem. There are so few people who believe in Hashem anyways, that why would we further divide those who believe in Hashem in the first place? Famous teshuvah of Rabbi Yosef Massas, very good. He has some teshuvah, I'm going to throw some more at you. Flying on airplanes on Shabbat, absolutely permissible. Rabbi Yosef Massas discusses electricity on Yom Tov, probably a very famous teshuvah you're familiar with. He's one of the first about the electricity on Yom Tov. Banit, what other teshuvot I have of Rabbi Yosef Massas?
With the butchers, they don't necessarily have to be Shomrei Shabbat.
Very good. When he comes to Tlemcen, he finds out that the shochatim and the butchers there are not Shomrei Shabbat. They're not observant in the halachot of Shabbat. And there's some 9 butcher shops, and he goes through this thing trying to get them to become, doesn't work. Trying to shut them down, doesn't work. At the end, he letters a famous teshuvah in which if these people are observant in matters of kashrut, you can rely on their meat, on their butcher shops without any supervision because they are observant of the laws of kashrut. And even if they're not observant in the laws of Shabbat, they don't lose their cheskat kashrut, their kashrut status because of that. There's a fascinating teshuvah in which Rabbi Yosef Massas comes to a situation, sees what cannot be changed. Can you hear me now? See what cannot be changed.
He disappeared.
I know see what cannot be changed, and then there's a setting on the phone I didn't adjust before. Sees what cannot be changed, and comes up with a novel teshuvah to deal with that situation. Ultimately, Rabbi Yosef Massas is a yachid. He's not just radically lenient. There are other times Rabbi Yosef Massas goes in different directions. But now, in the 9 days, for example, this is a teshuvah in which Rabbi Yosef Massas is famous for. Now, what happens with a couple that comes to Morocco for a visit, Algeria for a visit? They're going to go back to France. You know, France for North African Jewry was the melting pot. It was what America was to European Jewry. It was where Jews went to assimilate. And Rabbi Yosef Massas had a couple that was leaving. They wanted to get married in a chuppah and kiddushin. But if they would go back to France, they would miss the opportunity and they would just live together without chuppah v'kiddushin. And he deals with the question of, can I do a wedding for them not in the 9 days? Can I do a wedding for them on the eve of Tisha B'Av? So Chet of Av, the 8th of Av. And Rabbi Yosef Massas writes that not once and not twice did he do a wedding for such couples on the eve of Tisha B'Av, and he had no fear at all. Because compared to a halacha that a couple should be married properly, he's not worried about a minhag that develops of not getting married in the 9 days. Now, he has restrictions there, maybe not weddings with music and dancing, but he most definitely performed chuppah v'kiddushin in that time period. Rabbi Yosef Massas, I'm telling you, it's a tanu to read his writings, even if we don't always agree with his conclusions. By the way, most of what I shared with you beforehand is not the opinion of Mori Harav Yaakov Peretz, but nonetheless, to read such a chacham who was not afraid is not a word. Not afraid, he didn't care what other people would say. He did what he needed to do in the Kehillat that he was in. You don't find chachamim like that, and you're not going to be surprised that in a page from now, we're going to discuss all of those rabbis who didn't really love him so much because of those opinions. Rabbi Yosef Massas discusses lighting the Chanukiah on Chanukah with electricity and the permissibility of that. We're going to be discussing today the most extreme ramification of his belief that electricity can be used to light Chanukah candles. And that is, that according to Rabbi Yosef Massas, we'll get there. We'll get there. Rabbi Meir Abitbol, who's a dear friend of mine, is someone that I visit often in Israel. He's the owner of the World Sephardic Library. More, that's where you shop. That was you, right, who said you were there? Nachon. Rabbi Meir Abitbol writes the following words at the bottom of page 1, bottom left. Betkufat ha'askala b'Morocco, in the Enlightenment period, the Haskalah period in Morocco, לא נתנו רבותינו לאף אחד מישראל להרגיש כרשע בפני עצמו. The rabbis in Morocco had one mission, and that was that no Jewish person should consider themselves an evil person. No Jewish person should consider themselves outside of the Jewish community. That was their goal. Their goal was, how do I combat a Haskalah movement that is trying to suck people out of the Jewish community? I'm going to combat it not by throwing them out like other Jewish communities did, not by closing the door on them like other Jewish communities did. I'm going to keep them in by just letting them stay, by pushing the envelope as far as possible to make it as difficult as possible to leave the fold of the Jewish community. אלא להפך, to the contrary, ניסו לתת להם הרגשה שהדבר לא כל כך נורא. They tried to make it seem like it wasn't so bad. ומצאו להם היתרים וסמך לקולות בהלכה על מנת שלא יבעטו בתורה. וממילא לא יהיה להם חלק ונחלה בה. They tried to do whatever they could, even if it was tremendous novel interpretations of halakha, so that people shouldn't consider themselves violators of halakha. Because if I think that I'm violating halakha, I'm not going to keep any halachot. And if I'm not going to keep any halachot, then I'm definitely going to forsake my portion of the Jewish community. And Chachmei Morocco did everything they could to combat the wave of secularism that was pulling people out of the community by fighting fire with fire. By essentially saying, you want to push the envelope? We're going to push it for you. You won't be able to leave. And whereas some obviously view that as giving in, the truth speaks for itself. When you look at Yotzei Morocco, who dealt with a very similar, although different in its own right, Enlightenment movement as European Jewry did. And if you look at 2 or 3 generations afterwards, how many Moroccan Jews are still married to Jewish people, are still part of the Jewish community, still observe the holidays and Shabbat? And look, unfortunately, the other communities, how many of those descendants have nothing to do with the Jewish people? In fact, some days, and I told you, I think Daniel was surprised, I said there are 100,000 Jews in San Diego, but 71% of them aren't affiliated with anything. I sometimes wonder, how do we count them? And how do we even get to them? These are people in America of 2,000. There were 600,000 Jews living here as Christians. So it tells you the numbers that we're dealing with an assimilation rate. I'm sure everyone gets scared by all the Bible-thumping rabbis that talk to you about assimilation rates. Those numbers are still real. The amount of Jews that leave. Chachmei Morocco did everything possible to keep people inside the fold. Give me one moment, please. And that brings us to the next page. Page 2 is really just many of the books that Rabbi Yosef Massas wrote. Books on halacha, books on different ideas in Jewish philosophy. The famous commentary we mentioned last week about Perkei Avot and Achalat Avot. There are a number of the Haggadah of Pesach, a book on Chanukah. Some of his books have been reprinted, so this book, Otzar HaMichtavim, has not been reprinted. It's available for free as a PDF on HebrewBooks.org if you wanted to download the 3 volumes. They have reprinted the 2 books of his Sheilot V'Tshuvot, Mayim Chaim, the Waters of Life. His grandson has recently reprinted 4 volumes of Mayim Chaim. How do you reprint books that didn't exist? Essentially what he did was he went through his grandfather's Otzar HaMichtavim and extracted any halachic letters that were there. Ignored the ones about history, ignored the personal letters, just took out the halachic letters and came up with 2 more volumes of Mayim Chaim. This set is available quite inexpensively in Israel today. If it's still on the shelves, it's a private printing. And it has some fascinating teshuvot, and it's probably the most complete set of books that you can buy of Rabbi Yosef Massas and Halacha. There is a Dayan actually in the United Kingdom who I don't know anything about aside from that I have some of his books, who has printed some of Rabbi Yosef Massas' books. He's a rabbi, maybe Rabbi Pinchas Toledano is his name, and he printed a Geresh Yerichim, which is a book on Gittin of Rabbi Yosef Massas. For a long time, that was the only edition of that book that was available. The grandson printed that book again in his own text in the back of the 3rd or 4th volume of this series too. So if you would like to explore more of his writings, that's definitely the place where I would suggest that you start.
And Toledano is a very big deal.
Oh, okay. Baruch Hashem. So he is mamash single-handedly responsible for keeping some of those works alive in the last, I can't even tell you how many years. Yeah, Baruch Hashem. Maybe if I get back, I would really love an opportunity to meet him. That's something, if somebody here has an in, I would love to make that happen. Okay, I'm bringing you to page 3. I debated greatly before adding page 3 into this.
I'll just ask a question.
Sure.
I know obviously this rabbi is approaching things through halakha, but what would from a sort of I don't know exactly the word, but from a maybe philosophical point of view, what's the answer to someone say who's a Reformed Jew saying, look, we're trying to keep people in the Jewish community, keeping people as Jews. You're doing it your way, we're doing it our way. What's the difference?
So I was very recently in a rabbin.
In the sense that they might say, look, your people are carrying, so you're saying our Eruvim don't exist, but we know this is a game that you're playing. It's all that they might put that accusation out. Rather than being creative, you're just kind of playing a game to say, black is white because it suits you. And we're more honest because we're saying, look, you don't need to do this. It's okay to carry on Shabbat.
So, by the way, this is actually a very good point of conversation, and it has a lot to do with how you view halakha, and it's our next shiur together is going to be about the elasticity of halakha and exactly how that works and how the system works. I would say in a one-line answer, the answer would be there's a difference between innovation that comes from a place of disregarding that which is old and creating something new, and innovation that comes from a place of profound respect of the old, and that is what is motivating you to create that which is new. Really, the end result may be the same. It's the motivation in the middle, the process that one goes through. Is it disregarding the old, or is it, this is what the old is demanding from me to do right now? And I'll be honest with you, is I think that had the reform movement taken place outside of the limited geographic place of Ashkenaz, I think the Chachamim of other countries would have dealt with the healthy critique of that movement very differently. That movement, it didn't come, it's not a purely evil movement. I'm not a reform rabbi, and I think everyone knows that, but that movement came with serious critiques on the, okay, maybe, my wife is laughing, maybe not everyone knows that. Okay, I'm declaring now. That movement has serious critiques on what was a very rigid orthodoxy. And there's a reason why that movement didn't take place in countries that didn't need it. Because the Judaism was already flexible. The Judaism was already moving on its own. And I think that there is definitely what can be studied from the critique of that movement. I think it would be very fair to say that the reform movement of today and the reform movement of yesterday are most definitely not the same thing. Some things have been much better, and some things maybe not. Nonetheless, I think that the bottom line is, what is the perspective on halakha? When you're looking at the old, is it something that you don't consider binding on you? If that's the case, then your innovation is not innovation, it's just displacement. But if you view halakha as something that is living, that is breathing, that you are obligated in and bound to, and you are simply extending or adjusting things because that's what you believe the chachamim would have done in your situation, that's definitely going out on a limb. It's definitely a risk that a posek takes in such a situation, but it's one that is warranted by halakha, and we are going to spend much time actually discussing that next time we learn together. That's it.
If I may add something.
Please.
I actually read something quite interesting about reform in other location. I was researching about Israel Moshe Hazan, and actually there was a small Sephardi reform group that disappeared because essentially Israel Moshe Hazan kind of eliminated it by accepting certain, let's say, leniencies. There was this movement actually in England, in the Spanish-Portuguese community in London, and they broke away regarding Yom Tov Sheni, and Israel Moshe Hazan defended the practice of Yom Tov Sheni on Halachic grounds.
He wrote a whole book about it, Kedushat Yom Tov. That's the whole book he wrote to combat this idea.
But he allowed this leniency of basically counting people that desecrate Yom Tov Sheni in the minyan, and basically saying that it's better for people to desecrate the Yom Tov Sheni but acknowledge their sin, rather than kind of like making up a new thing where they just ignore halacha, and that basically killed what was the birth of Sephardic reform. It's actually quite interesting.
Yeah, that's a very good. I just didn't think somebody was that familiar with that. Rabbi Moshe Hazan dealt with this issue exactly like what you said. He preferred that people should be honest. It's okay. I want you to keep Shabbat, but at least tell me that you believe that you have to keep Shabbat and then break it, instead of telling me you don't believe in Shabbat in the first place. It's a different mentality in terms of, and he explains this: someone who violates a biblical commandment out of desire, out of need, but knows that it's a biblical commandment, is still greater than one who violates only a rabbinic commandment, but out of blatant disregard for our rabbis. He viewed this disregard of halakha as the problem, not the exact level of observance of halakha. Essentially, you end up crushing the opposition when you allow such a perspective in the Jewish community. And I'll be honest that I'm sure that other chachamim were unable to do this because of the lack of control, the handle that they did not have on their community in those situations. And Rabbi Moshe Hazan was a very powerful figure. Interestingly enough, he was brought to the United Kingdom by a very corrupt Jewish politician. Rabbi Faur has a book on Rabbi Moshe Hazan, and a footnote there elaborates about him. We just studied this in my Kehillat together in Shabbatot. We studied that book about Rabbi Moshe Hazan, and it's fascinating. They recruit him into a war that's not his war, but I think he did wonders with it anyways. It's very interesting. Thanks for bringing that up. Let me take a tangent with you for just a few minutes. Oh my gosh. This page 3, I was really debating whether I should add it or not. I've been collecting over the years other rabbis, namely Sephardic rabbis, because it's not fair to pick on Ashkenazi rabbis for not knowing of or not liking some random Moroccan rabbi who said things they couldn't swallow. But other Sephardic rabbis who knew Rabbi Yosef Massas, who knew the greatness of Rabbi Yosef Massas, and still chose to vilify him for some of the things that he said. There's a famous chacham, Rabbi Moshe Malka, alav shalom. Rabbi Moshe Malka was a dayan in Israel after being a dayan in Morocco. I have a few of his works. Unfortunately, those have been out of print for some 30 years now. Rabbi Moshe Malka was asked whether in Morocco Rabbi Yosef Massas was considered a mainstream rabbi or not. I mean, did people like him in Morocco or not? And he writes the following sentence. He says, those who love the truth loved Rabbi Yosef Massas. And those who loved chumrot hated Rabbi Yosef Massas. Those who loved the truth loved him, and those who loved stringencies, they hated him. Meaning it's a war between truth and stringencies, not between leniencies and stringencies. Rabbi Yosef Massas was really a Talmid Chacham in good standing. If I'll tell you that Rabbi Shalom Massas, the younger cousin, makes a few interesting points. Rabbi Yosef Massas says you don't need a eruv. He said, but I remember going around Morocco putting up the eruv with him before Shabbat. I remember checking every Erev Shabbat the eruv with Rabbi Yosef Massas. Rabbi Yosef Massas, his wife covered her hair, his daughter covered her hair, his granddaughter, still alive, covers her hair. Rabbi Yosef Massas, many of the rulings that he put out were put out in a category of limud zechut. I want to keep the Jewish people in. I'm not telling you to abandon the halachot that you're observing according to Shulchan Aruch. I'm telling you that I'm in a war and I'm going to win this war. And this awoke the ire of many chachamim. There's a Rabbi Natan Neta Leiter, who's an Ashkenazi rabbi who received Rabbi Yosef Massas' book in the mail. Rabbi Yosef Massas had very unique connections with Ashkenaz. In fact, for many, many years, he had a steady column that he was publishing in the Satmar newspaper, Bet Vad Chachamim. That's a fascinating little tidbit of history. He pulls out of the Satmar newspaper when he gets a copy of the newspaper and sees a whole attack against Rabbi Kook, who's the chief Ashkenazi rabbi in Israel. And he goes to war against the publishers of the Bet Vad Chachamim, demanding they retract their opinion. They obviously won't. They're Satmar. And it ends up in a real war of words in which Rabbi Yosef Massas says you shouldn't title your newspaper Bet Vad Chachamim, the house of Torah scholars. Rather, you should title it Bet HaKiseh, the toilet. You know, that's what it is. It's all you have over there. And he was adamant that this newspaper should be put out of commission. And he tells them, the Bnei Korach lo metu. I now know what it means that the children of Korach didn't die. They all live in Satmar. That's where they are. He was quite vocal about his opposition to them, and he not only does that cause him to leave the Satmar publication, it ends up causing him to write a letter to Rav Kook and to get to know him personally. And there are some tremendous letters of correspondence between, I have a shiur somewhere on YouTube, the correspondence between Rav Massas and Rav Kook. Rav Massas, the first Moroccan rabbi, he tells him, I heard that you let Avodah Zarah. I heard that you don't care about Shabbat. I heard that you... Tell him all the things the Satmar said about him. And then says, Rav Kook, I demand an explanation from you. And Rav Kook explains. And from there on out, Rabbi Yosef Massas only refers to Rav Kook as HaMelech B'Yerushalayim, our king in Jerusalem. That's how he refers to him. It's a fascinating... And Rav Kook writes about Rabbi Yosef Massas. He gets a package of his books in the mail. And he says, Nitmal'u kol ta'ei libi ora. All of the cells, all of the chambers of my heart have been full of light for receiving your books. A beautiful friendship that is born out of the hatred of the Satmar magazine. So this Rabbi Leiter must have also received some of the books of Rabbi Yosef Massas, and he says, Shalom, lichvod yidi agon mufla umuflag b'Torah, Rabbi Yosef Massas. Hello to my dear friend, Rabbi Yosef Massas, the rabbi in Tlemcen. Sifro heyakar higiani b'moado. I received your book, Mayim Chaim. I found beautiful and straightforward things in your work. But because the Torah is a Torah of truth, I can't lie to you. I must tell you the truth. I found some things that didn't sit well with me. And I'm not able to just be silent about them. Because people will say that if I was silent, it must be that I agree with the things that you say. Those things which you decided to be lenient about, you should know that if you would publish these halachot here in Ashkenaz, the whole country would be laughing at you for writing these things. But there's only one way I could justify perhaps the things that you've said. Our rabbis say you should not judge a person until you're in his place, and I don't know the realities that you're up against that are causing you to write the things that you're writing. Here begins a collection of critiques on Rabbi Yosef Massas that I only wrote, put them together not so you should think that they're valid, but so you should know that unfortunately it goes to do with our first shiur. The fate of a person who thinks for themselves in the Jewish community is to be ostracized, to be attacked on all fronts. And this is essentially what happens to Rabbi Yosef Massas. Rabbi Matzliach Mazuz, who's a Tunisian rabbi, writes, "Of a sefer chad be'Algeri, there was a book that came to me from Algiers, Shareitiv Mizeh Shanim, I saw years ago. Velav de samchahu klal, you cannot rely on this book at all." And later in the back of the book, they make sure that you know that that's the Mayim Chaim of Rabbi Yosef Massas. He writes similar things in another section of his books. Rabbi Meir Mazuz, who's the son of Rabbi Matzliach Mazuz, who's now in Bnei Brak, is famous for saying about, he's all about gematrias and acronyms, and that's Rabbi Mazuz. He's a big into playing with words. He's a big Baal Medagdek. He's really into the language of Dikduk in Hebrew. And he says Massas is the acronym of Mutav Shiyush Anashim Shogegin. That people should at least sin unintentionally, then sin intentionally. That's his name. That's what he's all about. And he says, in that which my father said you shouldn't rely on him, he says, okay, but you should, in certain situations, you should see what he's saying and make your own decisions about what he says. Perhaps the harshest critique that's relevant to us is from Rabbi Yosef. Rabbi Yosef, unfortunately, as much as he was criticized in his life, you would think that the message that he would walk away with that is to maybe let other chachamim live. Sometimes he persecuted people even more harshly than he was persecuted himself. And here he has a famous teshuvah in Yabia Omer, in which he discusses something that Rabbi Yosef Massas says he saw in Morocco. He saw the great rabbis of Morocco do something. Then listen to what Rabbi Yosef writes, the bottom right column of page 3. Gam b'shut Mayim Chaim Massas. Also in the book of Mayim Chaim of Rabbi Yosef Massas, He'id b'shem Hagon Rabbi Chaim Aman Migdolei Rabbanei Waharan. He testifies that he saw that one of the great rabbis, Rabbi Maman, that he was lenient in this matter. And listen, even though usually you should never rely on the Piskei Halacha of Rabbi Yosef Massas. Mikol makom, nonetheless you can rely on his testimony. Kasher le'edut hayat. He was still a kosher witness in a bedin. So even though we don't rely on his halachic opinions at all, but he was still a kosher Jew, and if he says he saw something in Morocco, you can believe him. The fact that we live in a generation that someone could write such a thing about Rabbi Yosef Massas makes my hairs stand up on end. It's not the only place. Rabbi Yoshua Maman, who was he just passed away recently. Rabbi Yoshua Maman was one of the last of the Chachamim who was in Morocco who came to Israel. And he argued with Rabbi Yosef Massas in one of his letters, and Rabbi Yosef, in his approval to that book, writes, Yafeh hisig kvod torato al mori harav Yosef Massas. It's good what you did that you critiqued Rabbi Yosef Massas. שכתב דברים מתמיהים מאוד, he wrote very bewildering things. למען כבודו אמרתי לא אזכרנו בתשובתי. I've decided to respect him. I'm just going to omit any references to him in my letter in Yabia Omer. In fact, I was recently studying Halichot Olam with my wife. It's Rabbi Yosef's commentary in the Ben Ish Chai. And there, it was when Rabbi Yosef wrote it when he was very young. There, we just came across a section, he quoted Rabbi Yosef Massas. That was probably before he made up his mind not to quote Rabbi Yosef Massas anymore. It was a slip up. There's a story here from the book Rabbeinu about Rabbi Yosef that talks about Rabbi Yosef saying how when Rabbi Yosef Massas came to Israel, nobody wanted him as a rabbi in Israel, and how they did everything they could to not get him to be a rabbi in Israel. Rabbi Yitzchak Nisim led the campaign against not having him as a rabbi in Israel. Ultimately, Abba Chushi, who was the mayor of Haifa, appoints him as the chief rabbi of Haifa. That's not accurate history, by the way. He was unanimously appointed as chief rabbi of Haifa by all the parties in Haifa at the time. Nonetheless, Rabbi Yosef says because he wasn't really involved in the politics of the rabbinate there, he didn't voice an opinion against him, and it worked out well. Because how did Rabbi Yosef Massas repay Rabbi Yosef's kindness? Look at the last sentence here. Harav Yosef Massas diber im kama anashim bishvil shivachru b'Rabbeinu l'Rav Rashi. When it came time for Rabbi Yosef to become the chief rabbi, Rabbi Yosef Massas was instrumental in pulling some strings to make sure that Rabbi Yosef could become the chief rabbi of Israel. That's normally how you repay someone for the good that they've done to you. Here there's a Yemenite source, Rabbi Yitzchak Ratzabi, says some pretty terrible things about Rabbi Yosef Massas. He says that he writes some unusual things. It's obvious to anyone who reads his writings that he collected foreign ideologies from broken places. Well, you'll see this all over his works, and he says he'll write about it in a different place. And again, the only reason I brought this to you was to let you know that Rabbi Yosef Massas was not a stranger to controversy. Nonetheless, he still decided to write the things that he wrote. In the interest of time, I have to actually give you the shiur that I said I was going to give today. So let's do that. On page 4. This poem here was written by Rabbi Yosef Massas at the beginning. Oh, I put the wrong source. Source 1 shouldn't say that. Source 1 should say, this is the introduction to his book, Mayim Chaim. His book, Mayim Chaim, the first volume, he prints this poem to his book in the cover. I actually once translated it to English. Let me see if I can pull it up for you and paste it in the chats. 1 second.
Where do you have it posted? Maybe I'll be able to pull it up.
No, I have it here. 1 second.
Okay.
I once started writing a book about Rabbi Yosef Massas. And here you go. I translated this poem. One second. There must be more than that. Okay, that's the poem, my rough translation of the poem of Rabbi Yosef Massas to his book. Essentially, he tells the book that don't worry. There will be people that read you who don't like you. They'll move their lips at you. They'll try to critique you. But you should know that one day you will fall into the hands of those who can appreciate the good inside of you and disregard the things that they don't agree from you. I've never in my life read a sefer where someone writes a poem to his book. Comforting the book, I will send you out into the world and people will not love you. But you should know that there are good people everywhere who will appreciate you for what you're offering. It's a very special thing. I wish I had the time to read this with you. Maybe it was another time, but I posted the translation there for you. Rabbi Yosef Massas, here is what I came to talk about today. He mentions that you can light Chanukah candles. I know it's not even Tisha B'Av yet, I'm talking about Chanukah, but it's important. He mentions you can light Chanukah candles with electricity. If you want to talk about electricity and Chanukah candles, we could do that in the shiur where we talk about electricity in general. But here he goes one step further and he says the following thing on the bottom of page 4, source 2. This is in his book Ner Mitzvah. He has a book on the laws of Chanukah, but it's also the artwork of Rabbi Yosef Massas. Here I might be able to actually find you. No. Rabbi Yosef Massas writes the following thing. And furthermore I say, not just can you light Chanukah candles with electricity. Pashut ubarur, it's clear and it's obvious. Shim haya or electricity matzui bezman mikdash, that if electric light was available in the time of the Beit HaMikdash, Vadai shebo hayu madlikim hamenorah, they would certainly use electricity to light the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash, in the temple. Mishum she'i efshar להיות שנמלא ביתנו החולין באורים גדולים של אור החשמל היקר הזה. It can be that in our mundane houses we use this beautiful light of electricity to light our homes, שהוא מעין דוגמה של מעלה, which is some heavenly force in the world. ובבית אלוהינו הקדוש, in the holy house of our Lord, נדליק בשמן זית, we'll use inferior olive oil. שאפילו העניים הגרועים מעשים אותו בזמן הזה. Even the most poor people in the world don't use olive oil for light. Upashut, and not only is it a fact in my mind that if there was electricity in the Beit HaMikdash, that they would use it to light the menorah. Upashut shemimenu nadlik bebait ha'acharon shibane b'mira b'menu amen. He said, I'm certain that in the third Beit HaMikdash, when we build it, we will use electricity for the menorah and not olive oil. This is Rabbi Yosef Massas in a classic tangent in the middle of one of his writings, telling you, not only is it good enough for the Chanukiah, not only am I certain that if I was around in the time of the Beit HaMikdash and there was electricity, we would use it. I promise you that in the third Beit HaMikdash, they will use electricity to light the menorah with. And in source 3, this introduction to many of the critiques he starts getting back in the mail of different rabbis saying, how could you say such a thing? It's bad enough electricity for a Chanukiah. Rabbis say oils, you could light candles, but electricity. Now you're telling us in the Bet Midrash you could light it too? And he mentions that there are some rabbis who wrote kindly, he responded to them kindly. Some who wrote not so kindly, he responded to them in accordance with the way they wrote to him. And everybody, he gave them an answer. He answered everyone's letters. But there's one letter from all these letters that stick out the most. And that is a letter to a famous Chacham, known as the Pachad Yitzchak. Don't think Pachad Yitzchak, American Jewry. Think Pachad Yitzchak, Moroccan Jewry. This is not Rav Hutner. This is Rabbi Yitzchak. Today they'll call him Sebag, Asebag, Sebag. But when I heard Rabbi Shalom Massas say his name, he called him Rabbi Yitzchak Sebag, like that, Sebag. That's how he pronounced his name. The Pachad Yitzchak, the fear of Yitzchak, was a famous Rosh HaYeshiva in Morocco. He trained Rabbi Shalom Massas. He was a unique Talmid Chacham, unique. He was a powerhouse. There's a reason they called him the Pachad Yitzchak, the fear of Yitzchak. He was a fear-invoking Talmid Chacham. And he ultimately comes to Israel, becomes a rabbi in Tirat Carmel, just outside of Haifa, where he dies. It's amazing to me. He passed away in the 70s. And thinking of all the rabbis you hear about in Israel that you didn't have to ever waste your brain cells hearing about. Nobody ever talks about Rabbi Yitzchak Sebag. Nobody ever talks about Pachad Yitzchak in Tirat Carmel, in a little bit of Knesset he built for himself over there. Was the Rosh HaYeshiva of Morocco in the time. Rabbi Shalom Massas writes about him. He remembers that there was another Talmid Chacham, that's source 4. Another Talmid Chacham once came to the yeshiva and tried to teach a class in the pilpul style. You know, it's a certain type of Talmudic style, very prevalent in the yeshiva today. And he was asking the students questions and answers, and they answered this question in the way they learn Talmud today in the yeshiva. Nothing is straight. It's all like that. So what happens? Rabbi Yitzchak, the Pachad Yitzchak, stands up. He tells the rabbi, "You're just confusing my students. None of this Torah that you're teaching was taught Moshe Rabbeinu on Har Sinai. Get up and get out." He throws them out of the yeshiva. Doesn't want to hear this kind of Torah here. He says, "You're going to ruin their minds. Their minds are used to thinking straight. Now you're going to make their head crooked." And Rabbi Shalom Massas says that's what he felt when he came to Israel and he saw the yeshiva students that he saw. Because everyone thinks they're learning Torah, but all they're learning is crookedness. No one's actually learning Torah straight the way they should. No one is learning Tanakh and Mishnah and Talmud and Halacha straight. They're learning all kinds of things. Think about the weekly Dvar Torah you hear at a Shabbat table. If I go to one more Shabbat table where they tell me, it's the parasha of the golden calf. And the gold in Gematria is really silver. If you hold it up to the mirror upside down, the letters, if you read them backwards, it spells out a horse and a cow. It's a silver horse was in Har Sinai. You look here and say, are you serious? That's a Dvar Torah you share at the Shabbat table? And everywhere you go, that's the things they talk about. They talk about all kinds of nonsensical Divrei Torah. What about just telling me what it actually says in the Parashat HaShavua? Maybe discuss a real concept that comes out of Parashat HaShavua. Maybe tell us things, but nobody learns Torah like that anymore. People learn Torah in a crooked way, so don't get confused when you see that Judaism comes crooked. And here's what I really came to read to you today. So Rabbi Yitzchak Sebag writes a letter to Rabbi Yosef Massas, who's a friend of his. And he's concerned. I have a brother-in-law who writes me such letters. He's concerned. He loves me. He's concerned. You're saying things that will get you in trouble. Why do you say these things? Just be quiet. I don't just teach people Parashat. What are you going to teach people? My mom also, she doesn't write me letters. She just tells me that every day. Same idea. It's a care. Out of care, I'm writing you this letter. So he writes here on page 5, source 5. Lemalat harav kolel b'Yisrael lehalel, to the great Rabbi Rabbi Yitzchak Sebag. Shalom, shalom, hello to you. This is written in Elul of 1938. So this is right before World War II. And Michtav kvodo habahir v'amazhir hamaleh al kol gdotav aval levavit, your letter full of love that you sent me, higiani b'moado, I reached it when you sent it, umirov avodah, but because I was so busy, ותוקף המהומה והבהלה הפתאומית מכל חצוצרות תרועת המלחמה, because of all of the chaos and the tumult of the war that is surrounding us, I was unable to respond. But now I wish to write to you. ראיתי מה שכתב כבודו, כי גדלה שגיאתי לפניו על מה שכתבתי בספרי הקטן נר מצווה. I saw what you wrote, my dear friend, that you think that I made a grave error when I wrote in my book, Ner Mitzvah, Ki La'atid, because in the future, Yadliku Menorat HaMikdash B'Meor electricity, that they'll use in the future electric light to light the menorah in the Beit HaMikdash. Ve'amar ma'alato ki ze chalila neged echad mikarei hadat, and you accused me of violating one of the 13 principles of our faith. Which one? Sha'torah lo tishtaneh b'shum zman. The Torah cannot change. V'hi tzivta la'adlik rak b'shemen zayit zach. The Torah explicitly mentions to light with olive oil. And you're telling us that you can use electric oil. How dare you? And Rabbi Yosef Massas says, I have to respond. I have to say, I must ask forgiveness from you. There are many answers on this matter, and the truth is, there are many answers. There are 3 pages worth of answers. Let me try to get through just a few of them. Aleph, in general, the matters of the Beit HaMikdash will change. In the image of the 3rd Beit HaMikdash, which Cheskel the prophet saw, and I don't know how accurate Art Scroll's rendition of it is in the back of their Tanakh, but if you've ever seen someone's rendition of the 3rd Beit HaMikdash, it looks nothing like the 2nd or 1st Beit HaMikdash. It's a completely different Beit HaMikdash than that which Shlomo HaMelech built. Even though it says, Hakol b'chtav miyad Adonai alai, Hiskil kol menachot hatavnit. I by accident put Hashem's name there. Please be careful with this paper. I didn't intend to copy HaKadosh Baruch Hu's name there. V'gam hakelim nimtza hem shinui gadol. Even the utensils of the Beit HaMikdash are going to be different. He says, look, HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells him, המזבח עץ 3 אמות גבוה ואורכו 2 אמות וידבר אליי זה השולחן של לפני אדוני. Hashem says to make a wooden altar, when really before there was supposed to be a gold altar. וזהו מזבח הזהב שהיה בהיכל. הרי שבמקום של זהב יראו של עץ. Instead of a golden altar that we had in the past, we'll now have a wooden altar. ואף שגם שעשה משה היה של עץ, רק מצופה זהב. And even Moshe Rabbeinu's altar was wood that was covered in gold. מכל מקום הרי המידות משונות. I'm skipping to the next bold section. If you look at the measurements of the Beit HaMikdash as they were supposed to be done and the way that they're said, they're not the same. מידותיו משונות משולחן של Torah. If you look at the calculations in the Torah and what was actually built, the measurements were changed. ועוד תמצא יד הבודק שינויים אחרים. If you begin to comb through the Tanakh in the order of how the Beit HaMikdash should have been built, the measurements and how things actually were built, you will find discrepancies between what HaKadosh Baruch Hu said to do and what was actually done. וגם המלך שלמה, even King Solomon, the bottom of page 5, שינה מהכתוב בתורה, did different than what the Torah says. שהרי עשה מזבח הקטורת מאבנים וציפה ועצי ארזים. He made an incense altar out of wood and covered it with out of stones and covered it with cedar wood. והתורה אמרה שכולו רק עצי שיטים. But the Torah says don't use stones. The Torah says just use wood. So what is Shlomo HaMelech doing? He also changed. Maybe Shlomo HaMelech is also guilty of violating one of the 13 principles of our faith. ועוד הוסיף בקודש הקודשים, top of page 5, 2 כרובים מעצי שמן מצופים זהב. He now adds 2 of the what do they call them? Cherubs in the Beit HaMikdash, in the Holy of Holies. And if you keep looking, it says you'll find many differences. ואם כן, גם אם נאמר שלעתיד ידליקו המנורה במאור electricity, and זה שינוי בתורה חלילה. And that which I'm suggesting that they'll use electricity in the Beit HaMikdash is not changing the Torah at all, God forbid. ומה כי הדבר מוכרח ומוכרח במקומו. It's obvious that that's how it has to be. שלא ציוותה תורה בשמן זית זך, רק משום דלא אפשר באופן אחר, באותו זמן, והיכא דלא אפשר, לא אפשר. The only reason the Torah told us to use olive oil is because that's the oil that they use to light things with. But in a place where you don't use olive oil, the Torah wouldn't require from you to use olive oil. Though, the next paragraph. I have proof not just that we may change the lighting of electricity, that we'll use electricity instead of oil in the Beit HaMikdash. I have proof that maybe there won't even be a menorah in the next Beit HaMikdash. You're talking to me about changing the Torah? Says Rabbi Yosef Massas, Rabbi Yitzchak Lopez, did you ever read the Torah? I'm not saying disrespect to him. I mean, did you ever see all the places where we change things in the Torah? Look, the Midrash says, שלא תהיה מנורה במקדש לעתיד, there won't even be a menorah in the next Beit HaMikdash. Bialkut Yeshaya, the Navi says, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, we built your menorah once, and you destroyed it. We built your menorah twice, we destroyed it. The next time, we're not building one. If you want to build one, you build it, but we're not building it. Bet, the Yalkut, in Parshat Tetzaveh says, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu Yisrael, בעולם הזה הייתם זקוקים לאורו של בית המקדש. In this world you needed the light of the בית המקדש. אבל לעתיד אני עושה לכם אורה. But in the future I will be the one who gives you light. ובזה נראה לתרץ קושת מפרשים. למה לא זכה יחזקאל בבית לעתיד? רק הבית והמזבחות והשולחנות והמנורה לא זכה כלום. And now you can begin to understand why in the third בית המקדש of יחזקאל he mentions all of the utensils of the בית המקדש, but יחזקאל conveniently forgets to mention a menorah. Because perhaps there won't even be a menorah in the third Beit HaMikdash. So now is the Navi Yechezkel going against the 13 principles of our faith? Ve'od matzinu la'Rambam. There's a famous Rambam. Tell me what the Rambam believes about sacrifices, animal sacrifices. Someone here for sure is an expert in Moreh Nevuchim.
He was ambiguous.
Not ambiguous.
No, in the guide, he says that there might not be sacrifices, but in the Mishnah Torah it remains a bit unclear.
Okay, so I'm intentionally not asking about Mishnah Torah. What does he say in the Moreh Nevuchim?
That there will be sacrifices.
Why? How do you rationalize that with everything the Torah says about sacrifices?
So, according to him, according to Rambam, the sacrifices were just like something that God gave to Jews because they needed it in a way because they were not ready for a sacrifice-less faith.
So the Jews were used to worshipping deities the way everybody else did. And Hashem knew I can't take away everything. I took away their idols, now I'm going to take away their sacrifice too, they're not going to know what to do with themselves. The Rambam suggests that this was a sort of damage control. The Jewish people were going to have sacrifices, but limited to certain types of animals, certain times of day, certain places in the world, only in the Beit HaMikdash, only in the altar, only to limit animal control and to channel it to Avodat Hashem. Which means, and he brings a source text, which is, all the prophets say, Hashem doesn't need your sacrifices. Hashem says, do I need your cows? Do I need your bulls? Am I lacking animals in my world that I need you to burn some for me? Meaning, sacrifices are all about you, not about me. And says Rabbi Yosef Massas, Ve'af shekamu alav orin azeh, the bold letters in the bottom left. And even though there were many who attacked the Rambam for this, Mikol makom, nonetheless, ohavei shemo, those who loved him, Darshu v'chakru batku matzu, they researched the Rambam's words properly, and they found shedvara v'tamo hemamar meforash b'midrash, that there's an explicit midrash that says this, b'shem Tana Kadosh Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, in the name of Rabbi Pinchas ben Yair, a Tana in the times of the Mishnah, v'im ken, and therefore according to this, l'fizei yidbatlu la'atid kol hakorbanot, the Rambam who made the 13 principles of faith, according to him, in the future, there will be no sacrifices at all. There's been thousands of years since Jews worship idols. The Jews are one people. They serve only one God. And like we mentioned before about Christianity, Rabbi Yosef Massas says, and because the Jews have spent so much time in exile, they have caused the rest of the world to pretty much abandon idolatry as well. Kayadua, as is known, ve'en bezeh shinui b'Torah chalila dezil batal ta'ama. He says it's not considered changing the Torah. The Rambam is not changing the Torah. He's telling you the reason for the sacrifices is X. And when that reason doesn't apply, then the reality will change as well. That's not called changing the Torah. It's not sending his hand against the Torah. That's exactly what the Torah would have said according to the Rambam's understanding of it. And he goes to explain how with the Rambam's approach, you can answer a few other questions that rabbis had in different verses that they were unable to answer unless they were thinking like the Rambam. He says, look on page 6 on the top right. V'od da'adif min, says, you want a better proof than that? Ita be'Yalkut Mishleh. Look in the Yalkut Mishleh. Eze Shem Tov kanta Esther. What did Esther do to deserve? Shekol ha'moadim atidim libatel. All the holidays will be nullified in the future. V'imei ha'purim lo betelim le'olam. But Purim will never be annulled. So what does it tell you? It tells you that all the holidays that you know are going to be uprooted from the Torah. What is that against the 13 principles of our faith also? He goes here to critique the Rashba's answer of the situation. And he mentions here, in the bottom right, ודוגמה לזה מצינו ש"ס בברכות. If you look on the Talmud, במסכת ברכות, אמר להם בן זומא לחכמים, בן זומא tells the sages, וכי מזכירין יציאת מצרים לימות המשיח. Are we going to discuss the leaving, the exodus of Egypt when the Mashiach comes? והלא כבר נאמר, it already says, אמר לי לא שתעקר, הרי לבן זומא זיכרון יציאת מצרים יעקר לגמרי ולרבנן יתפל. There's a dispute between the rabbis and Ben Zoma. According to the rabbis, the story of the Exodus will be said, but it's not going to be so important anymore when the redemption comes. And according to Ben Zoma, we will dismiss entirely this whole concept, which is today a foundation of our faith. Zecher litzat Mitzrayim. Zecher everything. Everything is because Hashem took us out of Egypt. One day, we won't even talk about leaving Egypt anymore. Is that going to be against the 13 principles? Says Rabbi Yosef Massas. Now that the Chachamim themselves are telling us that this part of the Torah will be uprooted in the future? What do you do with the Midrashim? Look on page 6 on the left column. עוד אמרו במדרש, in ויקרא, the Midrash says in ויקרא, אמר רבי יהודן בר שמעון, כל בהמות ולוויתן הן כניגון של צדיקים לעתיד לבוא. All of the Leviathan, whatever this animal is going to be a toy for the tzadikim in the next world. Don't get stuck on agadot and their literal meanings. וכל מי שלא ראה כניגון של אומות העולם בעולם הזה, זוכר אותה בעולם הבא, כיצד הם נשחטים? Let's skip a little more. How will they slaughter these animals? Behemot notet Leviathan bekarno vekaro. The animal will come and slaughter the Leviathan. Imagine a whale, let's pretend, with his horn. Leviathan notet b'msapira v'necharu, and the Leviathan will take its fins and cut the animal's heads off. Is that even kosher slaughter? An ox ramming an animal cutting off someone's head with its fin. Is that a kosher shchita that tzaddikim can eat from it in the next world? And that's what our rabbis say. Amar Rabbi Abba bar Kahana, Amar HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, Torah chadasha me'iti tetzeh. A new Torah will come forth from me. Chidush Torah me'iti tetzeh. A new Torah will come out of me, says Hashem. Amar Rabbi Berachia, Rabbi Berachia says, Atid HaKadosh Baruch Hu la'asot la'avadav ha'tzadikim la'atid lavo. Hashem will make a feast for the tzadikim in the next world. V'chol mi shelo achal nevelot ba'olam hazeh. And anyone who did not eat not kosher meat in this world, zochel lirotot olam haba, will be able to have it in the next world. Hadahu dichtiv, and that's what the pasuk means when it says. And then he explains, bishvil shetochlu mimenu la'atil lavo. In order for you to be able to eat not kosher meat in the next world, you have to refrain from it in this world. I didn't intend to come here today to tell you about this treif fest we're going to have when the Geulah comes. It's not the purpose of today. Rather, to show you, Rabbi Yosef Massas is saying, who says that things don't change? Where did you get this idea that in Judaism things don't change? The Chachamim themselves are full of examples that are far more extreme than we will use electricity to light the menorah in the Bet Mikdash. We're going to be eating nevelot utrefot with the tzaddikim in the next world. That's not scary for you? There's not going to be a menorah in the next Bet Mikdash. There will be no sacrifices that the whole Torah talks about in the Bet Mikdash. None of those things bothered you, Rabbi talks about. Now you're coming to attack me on electricity? How dare I change one of the 13 principles of our faith? Uvinyan korbanot. עוד אמרו במדרש תהילים, במדרש תהילים, מהו מתיר אסורים? יש אומרים כל הבהמה שהתבאת בעולם הזה, מתאר אותה הקדוש ברוך הוא לעתיד לבוא. All of the animals that were not kosher in this world, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will make kosher in the next world. And it talks about other things. All the things that were not allowed in this world will be allowed in the next world. It talks about relations, nidah. That which was not allowed in this world will be allowed in the next world. Says Rabbi Yosef Massas, how is that midrash better than something that I said? Uvinyan korbanot. Want to talk about sacrifices? La'atid lavo kol hakorbanot betelin. The midrash in Vayikra Rabba says explicitly that in the next world, in Atid lavo, all of the sacrifices will be nullified. The korban todai no batel. The thanks offering will not be batel. Kol tefilot betelot. All of the prayers will be nullified. Haudai na betela. But thanks to Hashem will not be annulled. Meaning, all of these things will be rid of in the next world. Tefilot, korbanot. So I said electricity in the Mikdash, and now I'm a violator of the 30 principles of faith. Od Hamru Benida, in the Talmud, in Masechet Nida, on page 61, Amar Rabbi Yosef, Rabbi Yosef says, Zot omeret mitzvot betelot la'atid lavo, that all of the mitzvot will be annulled in the next world. And the next section talks about all the different books of the prophets, which will be annulled in the next world. And he ends off with the following paragraph. My time has come, on page 7 in the left column. Zeh. That's it. This is all I could really answer back to you, my dear friend, because of the short amount of time that I have. And there are many more words that I could have written here. But one thing I want for you to be certain, that what I wrote intentionally. I didn't just get carried away with my pen, like you said that I did in my letter. You tried to give me a way out. I said, Rabbi, maybe you got carried away. Says Rabbi Yosef Massas, ki hodot la'el, thank God, יש לעיתי מתק ורסן, או לכאורה בין טיב האמת והיושר והכושר והאושר. My pen never exaggerates. My pen always writes that which is truth. I never am going to write something that you can say, oh, he just got carried away. I never get carried away, says Rabbi Yosef Massas. ואנחנו עומדים עתה על סף התרצ"ט. Said we're now entering 1938, or maybe it's 1930, going into 1939. לכנס לשנה חדשה, we're entering a new year. לחיים טובים וארוכים ושלום. This is right before the Holocaust. I bless us with good, with peace, with long life. בכן כך נא ידידי את ברכתי. Therefore, my friend, please accept my blessing. היוצאת מעמקי ליבי, that's coming from the depths of my heart. תכתבו ותחתמו לאלתר בספרן של צדיקים. May you be written and sealed in the book of the righteous, לשנה טובה ומבורכת בכל טוב, for the year that will be full of blessing and all good. And now he does a little poem. I underline all the words that rhyme. ועוד רבות בשנים, דשנים ורעננים, והאל בוחן ליבות וכליות, and God, who understands people's hearts, ירחם על הארץ ועל הבריות, will have compassion over the earth and its inhabitants. ויתן שלום במלכויות, and will bring peace to all the different kingdoms. ויחדש ימינו כשנים קדמוניות, במהרה בימינו אמן. May he renew our life as in the olden days. He knows that war is coming. He sees the world is falling apart. And he's giving a blessing. May we live to see better times. Ani hayom samechtet. Ani, I, hayom. Harav Yosef Massas. Samechtet does not mean Sephardi taho. Don't be a racist. Samechtet means sefetav, or there's a few different things it can mean, but only it's like shlita. You should live long. I should live long and be well. And the purpose of today's letter. The reason I want to introduce you to this part of Rabbi Yosef Massas. We are so programmed to think that anything that we see that is different than the way we've heard it before, anything novel, what did we mention last week? Chadash asur min haTorah. Anything new is forbidden according to the Torah. Anything different than the way we've always done it is different. You know, most of the time, if you start asking Jews questions, is that really how you tell me, you can't do things different than the way we always did it. Is that really how we always did it? If I started digging back into the things you do, and I could show you that all the things that you do today or you don't do today, really 100 years ago, everybody did. That's not the way we always did it. So how can you argue that you're the traditionalist? And Rabbi Yosef Massas says tradition, Jewish tradition allows us to be innovative in halakha. It allows us to say something like, in the next Bet Midrash, I think we're going to use electricity, without being guilty of violating one of the 13 principles of our faith. And unless you can get used to thinking that halakha can change, that the realities which the Torah deals with can change, then you're going to be very confused when you come across sources that suggest that such things can happen. And the Yosef Massas says, the last thing you ever want to do is to attack me that I might be a heretic. It's because if I'm a heretic, I just took all the rabbis of the Talmud, all the rabbis of the Midrash, I took the Rambam, I took them all with me now to the world of heresy. We're all heretics, all of us, because all of us believe that in the next world there won't be korbanot. All of us believe in the next world we won't pray anymore. All of us believe that all the Jewish holidays will be desecrated. All of us believe that in the next world the food might not be kosher. All of us. So now, are we all heretics? Because that's a decision you have to make. And if you threw out all of your past, then what do you have to say for yourself? How can you put me on the wrong side of history when it's clearly you? And this attitude, this confidence, in Hebrew we would say this emunah, this belief in tzidkat haderech, the righteousness of one's path, the conviction that one has to know that what they're doing is correct. It's not that I'm being an innovator, I'm not being a reformer, I'm not being a violator of tradition, I'm doing nothing new. We are doing things the way Chachamim have always done them. And obviously that opens up a Pandora's box of, so where's the red line that you can't cross? Like, where do you stop? Who gets to decide what we change and what we don't change? Can anyone do that? In what areas can we do that? Do we have examples? Practical examples? They're nice theoretical conversations. Practical examples. And so next time we study together, I wish to introduce to you a letter of Rabbi Chaim David Halevi, who talks about the gemishuta shel halakha, the elasticity of halakha, the flexibility of halakha. And if you would tell somebody, hey, do you want to hear about the flexibility of halakha? They'll just laugh at you. Try it. Go to the Beit Knesset. Tell somebody, hey, you want to hear about the flexibility of halakha? What kind of nonsensical phrase is that? Flexibility of halakha? Halakha is not flexible. And the answer is it is. But in order to understand exactly how that works, we have to know how to learn halakha properly and who to learn halakha from. B'ezrat Hashem, that will be the topic of our shiur next week. But for today, a matter of principle. A matter of principle is that he was not violating one of the 13 principles. And not only that, but it's a matter of principle that Judaism changes. It's a fact. Every group of Jews in the world has changed and adapted, along with their Chachamim, led by their Chachamim. Those Chachamim in every place and every time knew how to adapt Judaism properly to make it relevant to the people that were there with them. And B'ezrat Hashem, we'll explore that more next week.